It's now 1 year since October 7th and the Al-Aqsa flood operation carried out by Hamas and the other Palestinian resistance factions. There have been so many updates and changes that have happened over the past year. The Palestinian resistance really has indeed changed the world in just this past year. And I don't think anyone leading up to October 7th last year and everything that's happened since would have expected the Palestinian resistance to be able to create such an impact on the world stage on so many different levels. On the ground itself, in the fight for Palestine, as well as international politics, global politics, US politics, the upcoming election. Despite all of the bluster, all of the atrocities, the massacre, genocide carried out by the Zionist occupation regime over the past year, it is 1 year and they have still not been able to defeat the Palestinian resistance, which they claimed they were going to do. Despite all of their efforts, all of their brutality, unlimited backing from the global empire, the United States, billions upon billions upon billions of dollars and weaponry given to them by the United States. Despite all of that, they have been unsuccessful to defeat this independence struggle, the struggle for national liberation that has hardly anything backing it from around the world. It's basically isolated on its own. But what it does have is the support of the Palestinian people, and that is what gives it strength. So today, to discuss this, we have a returning guest who you probably remember, Falastini Moghtareb, who is a Palestinian activist who has done excellent work, not only in the struggle for the liberation of his homeland, but also the anti-imperialist struggle globally. Welcome. Thank you for joining us again.
It's always a pleasure to be back with you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on Palestine.
Absolutely. And you've been, over the past year, reporting on your page, giving coverage of the situation. Especially, I think, of significance has been your coverage of the activities of the Palestinian resistance, which is something that we never see in the mainstream media. The way they want to portray it is, on one hand, there's the obvious propaganda that they give in support of Israel, but there's also, they try to erase the perspective of Palestinians, and especially the perspective of the Palestinian resistance. You know, they never talk about the achievements of the Palestinian resistance in fighting against the Israeli army. They never want to talk about that. It's almost as if, you know, they frame it as the quote-unquote Israel-Hamas war, which is a complete misnomer. It's not the quote-unquote Israel-Hamas war. It's a Zionist genocide against Palestine, which has been going on for decades. This is the latest iteration of it. But according to that name, you would think that they would show you, you know, they're claiming that this is a war between two sides. You would think that they would show you, okay, the Israelis carried out this operation, the Palestinians carried out this operation, but they never show you the operations carried out by the Palestinians. That is against, you know, the Israeli military. Of course, they'll always talk about quote-unquote terrorism and stuff like that, but they don't want you to know that the Palestinian resistance actually has a lot of successes on the battlefield against an enemy that has measurable more resources than they do. So can you get into a little bit about some of the successes and how the successes of the Palestinian resistance and what you've noticed about the Palestinian resistance over the past year?
Yeah, just to give the listeners an idea of how significant and important October 7th, 2023 was. You know, if you go back in memory, Nick, and think about even before Biden, when Trump was president, Trump was pushing for the American deal of the century. And he was trying to appease the lobby in the United States by moving the embassy, U.S. embassy, to Jerusalem. But more dangerously, he was promoting normalization, and he was targeting specifically Saudi Arabia as an important Arab regional power. He wanted Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel. And as you know, they are promoting the two-state solution, which we oppose. And when I say we, I mean the majority of the Palestinian people. And I can give you statistics that back that up. So it's not my own opinion of the matter. But look what October 7th, 2023 has done. The normalization project is stopped after Israelis managed to secure normalization with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and before that, Jordan and Egypt. So they were on a cruise line of gaining acceptance and recognition. And what that entails is the death of the resistance. Basically, the Palestinian cause was being brought to a morbid end. With October 7th, 2023, that is dead. The normalization project is dead. The two-state solution has been mortally wounded. And after October 7th, 2023, world recognition of the Palestinian struggle is unprecedented. Being an activist in the United States and Arabia for the last 30 years, I have never seen this number of people in demonstrations promoting Palestine. Not only has the number of people increased, but also the political ceiling has been raised. When I lived in the US 10 years ago, we wouldn't have dreamed of chants in the streets of thousands of people calling for liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. Now that's not only in the US, all over Europe and everywhere else, from Asia to Africa to Latin America. So the political ceiling has been raised. The faith of the people, the international community of grassroots activists and others in the victory of the Palestinian resistance has increased. Now people are thinking of a Palestinian state in the imminent future. We would have never imagined the government of Spain or Ireland recognizing a state of Palestine. Now this is a reality. What changed all of that? It was the success of the Palestinian resistance, not only on October 7th, 2023, but also for the last year. If it weren't for their victories over Israel, this continued support, increasing support, and more resilient principled stance for the demands of an independent Palestinian state, we would have never seen any of that. To go back to your question on what are the victories that the Palestinian resistance has scored in the last year, if you go back to October 7th, 2023, if you remember what the Israelis had in terms of objectives, they haven't been able to fulfill any of those objectives. Objective number one was to end Hamas. Hamas not only still exists today, 1 year after, but it's stronger than it has before. Objective number two was to return the hostages. Most of the hostages have been killed through Israeli bombing, indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas. And for however many remain, they're still to return them to their families in Israel. In fact, just before a few months ago, rallies were ongoing in Israel trying to pressure Netanyahu to secure a deal to bring back those hostages and exchange them for Palestinian prisoners. So they haven't been able to free the hostages. They haven't been able to end Hamas. They also wanted to bomb civilians. Right now we're looking at over 42,000 civilians in Gaza that have been martyred, close to 94,000 wounded.
And if I can just interject for 1 second there, those numbers, while they're internationally recognized and everything, those numbers are almost certainly an undercount, because there's no way of knowing all of the people who are dead under the rubble still. So the numbers are almost certainly much higher than that, and we won't know the full scope of it for some time.
Yeah, just to give the audience or listeners a perspective, if you go on the internet and you do a search, you'll get different figures, but pretty much everybody's reporting roughly around 40,000 civilians dead and close to 94,000 injured. Many of those injuries are children with missing limbs. And so their future has been pretty much devastated through this criminal and barbaric bombing that has lasted for 12 months. Can you imagine this kind of bombing taking place in World War II, targeting a German city for a full year? And you know how small Gaza is and how condensed in population it is. So nobody has been able to endure this kind of punishment. Yet the Palestinian people continue to steadfastly resist Israel and the Palestinian resistance inside of Gaza. We report, and as you mentioned on my page, almost daily casualties that Israelis have been hiding. So the resistance is well and fine and is victorious. Israel will lose this war in Gaza. There's no doubt about that. And the resistance led by Hamas is going to come out of it victorious.
Yeah, that's right. And, the media here in the West doesn't talk about that last point you just mentioned about how almost daily there are Israeli military casualties. They are taking casualties. The Israeli military, they are dying. They're being killed by the Palestinian resistance. And the media here doesn't want to talk about that. But the Israeli media actually, there's heavy censorship, but it's the type of thing where, there are funerals for the families and stuff. So it's hard to hide when, their own soldiers are being killed. It's a little bit difficult for them to hide that. But in the West, it's hidden by the media. They don't talk about that. They want to make it seem as though Israel, on one hand, Israel is a victim of supposed Palestinian terrorism on one hand, and on the other hand, they are an invincible force that it's unwise for you to challenge them because they're so strong. You can't hurt them. They're invincible. So just surrender, make peace with them, and that's the better strategy because they're invincible and you can't do anything to beat them. But what we're seeing on the ground, as you mentioned, it shows the opposite. They can be beaten. They can be defeated. And the interesting thing about the date, October 7th, last year, is that it's exactly one day after the 50th anniversary of the Egyptian victory in their attack against the Zionist occupation of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, at that point, it was portrayed that Israel was invincible. They couldn't be beaten. They had this fortified area on the Sinai Peninsula called the Bar-Lev Line, which military strategists were saying it would be suicide to attack. But what happened? The Egyptians attacked, and they drove the Israelis out. They beat them. And subsequently, in the end of that war ended with the Israelis having to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt.
Israel had turned the canal's east bank into the most formidable defensive barrier in the world. They called it the Bar-Lev Line, and part of it still stands today. The front of the line was a 70-foot-high wall of sand studded with heavily armed strongholds. Even if an Egyptian force managed to cross the canal through heavy gunfire, the IDF calculated that it would take them hours to blast holes through the sand wall, giving Israel ample time to send reinforcements to the front. Clearly, attacking the Bar-Lev Line was suicide, but on October 6, 1973, Egypt launched just such an attack. The attack began at 1400 hours. Egypt pounded the entire length of the Bar-Lev Line with every weapon available. As Egyptian bombers blasted communications positions, 4,000 guns rained shells down on the Bar-Lev strongholds in a 20-minute barrage. Israel's Air Force flew to the rescue, only to be met by surface-to-air missiles. At 1420, Egyptian troops carried 1,000 assault rafts to the banks of the Suez. Rangers had already slipped across and sabotaged the Bar-Lev line's ultimate defense against attackers, a pipeline of oil that was to be poured into the canal and set aflame. The first wave of attackers carried anti-tank weapons, bridge-laying equipment, and high-pressure water pumps. The water pumps were the ingenious solution to the problem of the 70-foot sand barrier. Israel thought it would take at least 12 hours to penetrate the barrier using explosives, but by simply using water to wear down the sand, Egypt broke through in less than 3. The 600 soldiers manning the fortresses were stunned by the sight of tens of thousands of Egyptian troops swarming toward them. The first stronghold fell less than an hour after the attack began, and the rest began to follow in a domino effect. For the IDF, it was almost inconceivable. Arab soldiers, never considered worthy opponents, had taken them by surprise.
So it's just very interesting how, and I think that's a part of the reason why the date was chosen. And at that point, that was the biggest, to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, at that point, the defeat that the Israelis faced at the Bar-Lev line was their, and them having to return the Sinai Peninsula, that was their biggest defeat to date. Would you agree?
Yeah, as far as the Arab army involved in a head-to-head confrontation with the Israeli army, the Arab armies have never defeated Israel until 1973 on October 6, when they smashed the Bar-Lev fortifications. Now, the Iraqi army was actually involved in 1973. It was involved in defending Damascus, which, because what happened in 73 is there were two fronts. There was the Syrian front, and then there was the Egyptian front. The Egyptian front scored a victory, but the Syrian front lost the Golan Heights. And so the Israelis could have conquered Damascus, and the Iraqi army intervened to protect Damascus from being occupied, despite the fact that Saddam Hussein was not on good terms with Hafiz al-Assad. But defending an Arab capital against Israel was always going to take the priority. Let me give you an idea of.
Let me just add one thing on that is that, and you're absolutely right on that. And the Iraqis were actually willing to continue fighting to try and retake the Golan Heights, but Hafiz al-Assad treacherously negotiated it away via Henry Kissinger. You can find pictures of him palling up with Henry Kissinger and agreeing to end the fighting with Israel, despite the fact that the Iraqi army is willing to continue fighting on.
Yeah, and that's why we've always maintained that Iraq had the principled position as far as the Ba'ath and Arab nationalism was concerned, because Hafiz al-Assad had always had a history of opportunism and dealings with both the U.S. imperialists and the Israelis. You know, many people don't know, but Hafiz al-Assad met with James Baker. And he also met, you know, at a time where tensions were all high, and Syria was supposed to be allied to the Soviet Union. And not only did he meet with them, they were planning on a meeting that would have put Rabin at the time with Hafiz al-Assad, but it failed. James Baker was trying to broker a deal where the Syrians and Israelis would sign a peace treaty, much like Sadat signed a peace treaty with Israel after the 1973 war, but it just never made it. It shows you his opportunism.
And by the way, where has Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian government been for the past year, right? Israel has bombed Syria repeatedly. What has the response of Syria been? Where has the Syrian government been? Which so many people who claim to, see online, these so-called Axis of Resistance supporters. What has Syria, I shouldn't say Syria because it's the regime, not the people. The people are very much would like to respond and defend their country and help Palestine, Lebanon, and others against the Zionist occupation. But the corrupt government has done nothing over the past year. It's really, it goes to the point we're making about Hafez al-Assad and his treacherous behavior as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sad story because, Syrian soldiers and officers are dying almost also on a weekly, or if not daily basis because of the Israeli targeting of Syria.
So as you said, it's been a year, and despite all the backing of the world's sole superpower, empire, really, the United States and, NATO, the NATO countries as well, they're part of that U.S. empire bloc. Despite all of that, they've been unsuccessful in what they claimed they were going to do. They claimed they were going to wipe out Hamas. Well, all they've been able to do in reality is massacre Palestinians, civilians, children, wipe out, all kinds of infrastructure, bomb hospitals. People have seen everything that's happened over the past year. They've been, despite all their bombing and their brutality, they've been unsuccessful in their attempts to, quote unquote, defeat Hamas. So it really shows how Israel is, they're in serious trouble. And the Palestinian resistance has been amazingly successful, despite being a guerrilla force, an insurgency. And we've seen this sort of situation repeated throughout the world, like in Vietnam, for example. The United States could bomb heavily, massacre civilians, but they could not defeat the guerrilla force fighting for the independence of the people.
Yeah, you know how when we started talking about Trump and the American deal of the century, today, because of October 2023, Hamas has only gained more and more popular support from the Palestinian people at large. Let me give you this survey that was done recently. Very interesting survey. It was done by, I'm looking up the name here, a man by the name of Khalil al-Shiqaqi. I think he's in the West Bank. Khalil surveyed Palestinians and found out that more than half of the Palestinians today thought that Hamas would be the best leadership going forward towards a Palestinian state. If you recall, the whole purpose of founding the Palestinian Authority was to pass the two-state solution. Ever since the signing of the Oslo Accords by Yasser Arafat in 1993 and the building of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and it used to be in Gaza as well before they got kicked out. The Palestinian Authority is a program aimed at finishing off the Palestinian armed resistance as its number one priority, and two, giving political recognition to Israel in exchange for Israel recognizing a Palestinian state in what is known as the two-state solution. Well, right now, if you surveyed Palestinians, you'll find, like this survey found, Khalil al-Shiqaqi, he found that Hamas would be the one winning those elections, not the Palestinian Authority. That Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority today, enjoys only 16% support, according to this survey. And 90% of the Palestinians surveyed asked for Abbas's resignation. More than 2/3 of those surveyed support armed resistance. Only 1/3 support the two-state solution. So when we tell what the Western audience and the Arab audience as well, that the majority of people reject the two-state solution, these kind of surveys support that. 2/3 of Palestinians today would reject a two-state solution and would support the armed resistance as an option, not only as an option, but as the only option towards building an independent Palestinian state. If we go back to the objectives that Israel had put for itself, we talked about ending Hamas, we talked about returning the hostages. There were two other objectives they wanted to achieve. One is the return of the Jewish settlers that live in the south and the north. Right now, as we speak, 250,000 Israelis Can you imagine? We would have never dreamed of this happening prior to October 7th, 2023. All of that northern part of Palestine that borders in Lebanon is a ghost town. Nobody lives there anymore. All the Israelis have been moved to the central part of Palestine. Same thing in the south. Ever since October 7th, 2023, all those settlements and everybody living down there has been moved to the central part. Right now, as we speak, Nick, there are, let me pull out the figures so I can quote correctly. There are 250,000 Israelis that have been displaced from the north and south. 120,000 of those were a direct result of the October 7th, 2023 attack. And so one of the objectives of the Israeli army, the reason why it's still there, is because it cannot guarantee the security of those 120,000 people that have been moved up into Israel and can't guarantee that they can go back to their homes. Same thing with the Northern Front. They've got roughly around 130,000 that have evacuated from the northern part. They can't return them to their homes, and they cannot guarantee their security. If it wasn't for the resistance, none of this would have ever happened. We have, practically speaking, liberated the northern and southern part of Palestine. The resistance, the combined resistance between the fighting going on in Lebanon and the fighting going in Gaza has cleared out the southern part of Palestine and the northern part. Here's another statistic. 500,000 Israelis have left Israel. That's 500,000. 500,000, not only did they leave Israel, but they canceled their Israeli residencies. That means they're not planning on coming back. And so all of this shows the utter defeat of the Israeli army. They have not been able to accomplish anything in Gaza. They will fail miserably in Lebanon. They will be defeated if they think they're going to carry out a land invasion of Lebanon. Right now, as we speak, their special forces are getting killed left and right. The figures that we have seen in just the last week of these incursions, because I think what they're trying to do now is they're trying to gauge, the ability of the Lebanese resistance to inflict casualties on them. And what we have seen in the media in Arabia in the last week, they're losing about 20 plus soldiers every few days for the last 7 days. So they're really getting hit hard, and they're not able to advance their troops. They really have to think plenty before they launch troops into southern Lebanon. All of these were accomplishments of the resistance. So now you've got political support on the part of the Palestinian people. You've got bankruptcy of the Palestinian Authority, bankruptcy of the Arab regimes themselves, and their plans to normalize relations. Israel hasn't been able to free hostages. Israel hasn't been able to end Hamas. Israel hasn't been able to return settlers to the southern part or the northern part. All they've managed to do, all Netanyahu has been able to accomplish, is assassinate key figures like Ismail Haniyeh and Hassan Nasrallah, which has only added to the resolve of the resistance forces. All he has been able to do is inflict death and amputations on innocent civilians. And they do this not only because they're vindictive and they seek revenge, but because they want to turn the civilians against the resistance. They want the civilians to abandon the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, and they want the Lebanese civilians to abandon the Lebanese resistance in Lebanon. That's why they punish the civilians. It's the old tactic that the American imperialists used in Vietnam with carpet bombing. Just kill as many civilians as you can, and they're going to abandon the resistance. Well, it failed in Vietnam, it's going to fail in Gaza, and it's going to fail in Lebanon.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And also, I mentioned this before, but I think everything that we're discussing here, a key component of it that needs to be emphasized is that all of these achievements of the Palestinian resistance, the Lebanese resistance, the failures of the Zionist occupation, this is all in the context of unlimited backing to one side in this conflict by the global empire, by the West, by the United States and the NATO bloc. They have literally everything at their disposal, the most sophisticated weaponry. The United States, and I think the UK as well, are providing them with intelligence. They have their own intelligence. You know, they have Mossad and other forms of intelligence gathering that they have. They have unprecedented backing, yet they are unable to achieve these goals. I think that makes this all the more astounding. And could you imagine, again, this is one side. On the Palestinian side, there's practically nothing. The Lebanese side, okay, Hezbollah is connected with Iran. They get Iranian backing. Hamas and the Palestinian resistance has gotten some backing from some countries in the past, but very minimal. It's very difficult to get anything into Gaza. And that's why when they carried out the Al-Aqsa flood on October 7th, what did they have? They had Kalashnikov rifles, RPGs, rocket-propelled grenade launchers. These are basic, the most basic weaponry. They have very basic weapons. They don't have anything compared to what the Israelis have. But nonetheless, the Israelis are unable to defeat them. And this is what we've seen in so many insurgencies around the world. You referenced Vietnam. Well, at least in the case of Vietnam, you know, the U.S. was fighting against the National Liberation Front, what they called the Viet Cong. But they were also fighting against the North Vietnamese army, which had tanks and artillery and an air force and such. Palestinian resistance doesn't have anything like that on their side. So it really, I think that context also has to be driven home all the more. But, you know, this brings us to a good point, I think, and I'd like to get your opinion on it, is the conflict in Lebanon now. Because so after October 7th happened, there was a question mark of what are the other forces in the region that claim to be against Zionism and claim to be part of a resistance bloc against Zionism. What are they going to do? And initially, it was minimal what was going on. The first group that comes to mind is obviously the Lebanese armed group called Hezbollah. Nasrallah, who's the leader of Hezbollah, who was recently assassinated by Israel, there was a lot of anticipation for his first speech that he was going to give following October 7th. I believe he gives a speech. He used to, I believe, give a speech once every month. And after October 7th happened, there was a lot of anticipation waiting for his speech, people anticipating he's going to wait for this speech to go in the war against Israel, join in. But depending on your interpretation, he did not do that. Now, his group began firing rockets at towers and such along the border, but it was very minimal compared to the conflict that the Israeli occupation forces were carrying out in Gaza. And in comparison to what Hamas carried out on October 7th, Hezbollah did nothing comparable to what Hamas did on October 7th. Some people will claim Hezbollah joined the fight from the beginning with these honestly minimal operations that they were carrying out. And also there's the context that Hezbollah is able to have a much stronger force in Lebanon. They have a much more sophisticated force in Lebanon than Hamas has in Gaza. They have a lot more firepower, weaponry, all kinds of stuff. They have access to weaponry and such, missiles. So despite their much greater capacity, fighting capacity than Hamas had, they did very little in comparison to, practically nothing in comparison to what Hamas and other Palestinian factions did. With that, you know, that whole context, I wanted to give that sort of background, give some clarity to, you know, what happened following October 7th. Now, you know, that whole background, there's a lot of thought about, well, what's going to happen with Hezbollah and Lebanon? Well, now we see what's happening. Israel has long had their Greater Israel plan to steal more Arab territory, not just Palestine, and we see them attempting to carry this out. So Yeah, now they're expanding their aggression against Lebanon. Could you give us what's your take on the situation in Lebanon, the background of all of that, and the group Hezbollah?
And it's an important question because right now what we're seeing among this huge pro-Palestine movement that's sweeping through the United States and Europe and even Asia and Africa and so on. What we're seeing right now is that there's a lot of confusion about Hezbollah and Iran. The pro-Palestine activists are sort of split. Half of them are for Iran. A lot of them are right now tilting towards supporting Iran, and it's especially with the last missile attack on Israel.
Just to clarify one thing real quick, activists in the West, because in the Arab world, I think there's a lot more clarity as to Hezbollah and Iran's true role in the region. But please continue.
Well, here in Arabia, it's also there is division. Half of the activists are for Iran, even Arab nationalists. If you look within the Arab nationalist camp, half of it would support Iran, the other half wouldn't. So there's even debate taking place right now. But here's the problem, and we've maintained this, from an Arab nationalist Ba'athist perspective for many, many years. Iran is not to be trusted. Iran is not true to the Palestinian cause. Never been. And if there was one thing that bankrupted Hezbollah and made it lose credibility, was because it was a proxy tool for the Iranians when it came to confronting Israel and for the aspirations of the Arab nation. Hezbollah lost a lot of its credibility when it sent its militias to Iraq, where they committed sectarian crimes against Sunnis in Iraq. Hezbollah lost a lot of its credibility when it sent its militias to the Syrian civil war, and they were involved in persecution and killings of many Syrian civilians, not only pro-imperialist opposition forces. So, when my friends or family members ask me, well, what did you think of Hassan Nasrallah? I told them I would give him 25% grade out of 100. I think he created a lot of problems for Israel, and I think he was sincere in his desire to attack Israel, but the Iranians stopped him. And that explains why he was never involved directly since October 7th, 2023, because the Iranians held him back. And that's my own personal opinion. Some people might agree or disagree with it, but we never, in the Arab nationalist camp and in the anti-imperialist camp at large, we've always maintained Iran was an opportunist force. It was a sectarian force. It was promoting its own agenda, and it was never sincere in its confrontation of either U.S. imperialism or Israeli Zionism. And people will argue about that, but how is it then that they just managed to bomb Israel with 180 missiles with no real casualties reported? Now, I understand that Israel is hiding its casualties. And if you live in so-called Israel, you know that all of the population is in bomb shelters, all right? When these missiles are launched, nobody stays in the street. They all evacuate the buildings. They go into bomb shelters. But I mean, if I threw 180 rocks at Tel Aviv, I could probably injure more than 2 people, But these are missiles that travel 2,000 kilometers and no injuries. It makes you suspicious of this whole act that was taken up by Iran. But the rank and file Lebanese will fight Israel. Even members of Hezbollah and others in the south that are right now inflicting serious casualties on Israel, they're going to deliver a defeat to Netanyahu in Lebanon. They're going to make them pay dearly for every minute they spent in southern Lebanon. I have no doubt of that. They will be defeated, and they are fighting. Hezbollah fighters are fighting. The file and rank are fighting. The civilian population is supporting them for the most part. And they're going to defeat Israel. So that's my own perspective on the role of Iran and Hezbollah with Israel.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point about the recent missiles fired by Iran against Israel, because so people will take that and say, oh, look, Iran and Israel, they really are enemies. They really, Iran supports the Palestinian resistance. Look what they just did. How can you deny that? But the fact that they just did this raises a very important point, because on one hand, it shows their capacity to actually fire rockets at Israel and get some things through. They fired, I think it was like 180 or 200, whatever, something like that, missiles at Israel. A lot were shot down, but a lot made it through. A significant amount made it through. And as you said, I think you're right in that there probably is more damage than the Israelis are letting on. But even taking that into account, factoring that in, it's not a lot of damage that was caused. Even if, we assume that there is some damage that is being covered up. Even so, it's pretty minimal, especially if you compare it to something that happened a few decades back when Saddam Hussein fired far less rockets at Israel. I believe it was 40 rockets Saddam fired at Israel for far less. Israel was not carrying out any kind of, yes, it was an occupation force carrying out genocide against Palestinians and occupying the Syrian Golan Heights and up to all kinds of criminal actions, but it wasn't carrying out anything as aggressive as it is now. But still, for far less, Saddam and Iraq did far more. There was huge amounts of destruction from those missiles that were fired. But anyway, what I was getting at was that this raises an important point, because now it shows Iran's capacity to actually strike Israel. Which begs the question, why did this only happen now? Why didn't this happen earlier? Iran claims to support the Palestinian resistance, claims to be against Zionism. Israel has been carrying out unprecedented genocide for a year, and only now Iran does this. I think that raises a huge issue for the people trying to say that Iran is some anti-Zionist force. Again, furthermore, many of their generals and high-ranking IRGC, quote-unquote, Revolutionary Guards figures have been killed by Israel over the past year. And there was a previous rocket attack, which was much smaller than what happened now. But what this shows us right now is that Iran actually has capacity to get some stuff through. And they have a lot more missiles. They have huge amounts of missiles. So it's not that they don't have the ability to do it, really. But again, similar to my point about Hezbollah prior, they had a massive capacity to inflict damage on Israel and render concrete military support to the Palestinian resistance, but they weren't doing it, and they're not doing it. I think that is a very key point. And also, as you mentioned, Hezbollah, despite their victory over Israel in 2006 and defeating the Israeli attempt to invade Lebanon in 2006, which, to their credit, and the other Lebanese resistance groups, because there are also other groups besides Hezbollah, they were successful. And that was a major victory, that Lebanon as a country and the Arab world, it was a victory for the Arab world overall, despite the fact that Hezbollah does have this political baggage and this these connections with Iran. But so they had a lot of credibility from 2006 in the eyes of the Arab world and Islamic world. But as you mentioned, their ideology, they have this sectarian Khomeiniist ideology from Iran, and their actions since then have damaged their reputation greatly. As you said, their activities in Syria in particular, despite the fact many people say, oh, well, the Syrian opposition was backed by the imperialists. Yes, many of the opposition groups were, but that doesn't justify atrocities against civilians. That doesn't justify sectarian violence. In fact, by doing that, by carrying out sectarian violence, you are furthering imperialism and Zionism. So their actions, for example, in Syria, have discredited to a large extent in the eyes of the Arab world and Islamic world. And I think the reason why they went all in Syria, but as we'd seen up until this point, now that they're actually being attacked by Israel, and Israel's trying to invade Lebanon, up until this point, they didn't have the will to go all in against Israel the same way they were willing to go in to back the Assad government, which should tell you something. If their whole thing is axis of resistance, their whole purpose is to oppose Zionism, why is it that they're so much more willing to kill Syrians than to fight against the Israeli army? But all that being said, I think there becomes a disconnect because on one hand, there's the leadership of Hezbollah and their connections to Iran, which I think, as you correctly pointed out, Iran is probably the one who has been holding them back from really fighting Israel up until, this latest point of Israel increasing its aggression. So I think there's this connection to Iran at the top. When it comes to the rank and file fighters, I think these are legitimate people who want to defend their country from Zionist aggression, even if the organization has these issues with it, because at the end of the day, despite their ideology connected to Iran, the Hezbollah fighter is a Lebanese Arab. So even though Iran and Khomeiniism isn't interested in fighting against Zionism and has actually worked with Zionism at many key points and U.S. imperialism at many key points, the fact that these fighters are Lebanese Arabs puts them in the firing line of Israel, whether the leadership of Hezbollah and them by extension connected with Iran, whether they want it or not, they are targets of Zionism, because as we've talked about, as we've referenced, Israel has this greater Israel policy which wants to conquer Lebanon as well and do to Lebanon what they've done to Palestine. So I think that's why we are seeing, despite these issues with the organization that we should have no illusions about, they are putting up resistance against Zionism, and we're seeing that now. Can you talk a little bit about what we've been seeing so far with the Lebanese resistance? Because the Israelis have been trying to invade Lebanon, but they've been unsuccessful so far.
Sure. Yeah. Hezbollah had a military leader by the name of Imad Maghniye. He was assassinated by Israel. And Imad Maghniye formed let's call it a brigade, called the Radwan Brigade. It's really famous in Lebanon. The Radwan Brigade was supposed to do on October 7th in the north. Like one of it's a special forces commando unit, and it was organized to be highly effective. And one of the plans, and they talked about this, Hezbollah talked about this, and Hassan Nasrallah talked about this for many years, but they never did anything. They were supposed to go into the Galilee, the northern part of Palestine, and attack Israeli settlements, much like Hamas did in the south, and maybe perhaps take hostages where they could exchange them for political prisoners. That never happened. These Radwan forces to this day, and you'll hear this on Lebanese media, you'll hear them talk about, well, the Radwan brigades will come into play. The Radwan forces will carry out, they call it the Galilee operation. And Israel is well aware of this, but yet it never happened. So that puts a big question mark on what, your Secretary General has just been assassinated. Your country is under invasion. Israel carries almost daily bombings of Lebanon, where hundreds, if not thousands, of Lebanese have been either killed or injured. When is it the right time for you to take a significant action against Israel that would deter it? Why not mobilize the Radwan brigades? Why not attack? You've cleared out all of the northern part of Israel. Why not go in there? That never happened. So we drew a question mark about the last missile attack Iran did. As you mentioned, there were two of them. The first one was pretty insignificant because it hit a military base in the Naqab desert. They weren't targeting civilian populations of Israelis or anything like that, or not even military bases within Tel Aviv and Haifa. This second round of missiles that allegedly only produced 2 injured Israelis, anywhere between 180 or more missiles and drones made it. They targeted Haifa, they targeted Tel Aviv, they targeted big cities with big populations of Israelis, yet there are no casualties. Another big question mark. So as we speak today, and in my own observation of what's going on, Israel is testing the waters. It's sending in its special forces, these commando units to the south to test out the resistance. And so far, the Lebanese resistance, including Hezbollah, has been very successful. Almost on a daily basis for the last 7 days, as I mentioned, we're seeing casualties on the Israeli side, anywhere between 20 or 20 more, either killed or injured. So they're losing that. It's ironically, this before I came this evening to log into the show, Netanyahu was visiting the northern border, and he was assuring the Israeli troops in the north, close to the Lebanese border, that they will be victorious. But we've heard him assure Israelis in Gaza that they're going to be victorious as well. But it's all talk, it's rhetoric. And they're losing right now in Lebanon. And my expectation is if they're foolish enough to drive their forces into Lebanon, that they're going to be defeated badly. And they haven't forgotten 2006. They know what happened in 2006. They know how capable these Hezbollah and other Lebanese fighters are. They're going to fight them till death. Because a lot of those fighters, Nick, and this is something the listeners should know, they're actually native to the south. These are their towns and villages. They come from that area. They know the terrain very well, and they're defending their homes and families. So you can imagine what kind of a fight they're going to put up. They're going to defend their country, they're going to defend their homes, they're going to defend their families, and they're going to defeat the Israelis.
Yeah, and there's been, you've been posting about this, how the Israelis have been trying to make incursions into Lebanon, and so far they've been repulsed by the Lebanese resistance. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, then in the last 7 days where I've been reporting, and others in Arab media, we've been following video footages of Israelis carrying their dead and injured, helicopters landing in southern Lebanon. There's been numerous statements made by the Israeli generals, almost on a daily basis, that this is a fight in Lebanon that they're not going to win, and that their capabilities won't allow them. I mean, I even read at one point an Israeli speak about how they don't have enough tanks to go into Lebanon. Mind you, they've been fighting in Gaza for the last year. And with this overwhelming support that America has given them in weaponry, bombs, political support, there's even been talk of American commando units involved in Gaza and failed attempts to free the hostages or target Hamas leaders or fighters. They've spent a lot of money. They're worn out. Their soldiers are demoralized because they haven't achieved anything in Gaza other than kill innocent people. And the latest we've heard is there are no more Israeli brigades in Gaza. There's only the 162, the 162nd brigade that's left in Gaza and some reserve soldiers. All the brigades have been pulled to the north in an anticipated invasion of Lebanon. So all of their capabilities and resources are now moved out of Gaza, which shows you that they're not achieving anything in Gaza other than be sitting ducks for the Palestinian resistance. And they've moved all their troops to the north. Also, bear in mind that Yemen is involved, Iraq is involved. There are almost, every other week there's a missile or a drone that's been targeting Tel Aviv or Israel that is coming from Yemen or that's coming from Iraq. So, maybe segueing into the next topic of the US government and the US elections, I'd hate to be in the shoes of Kamala Harris or Donald Trump because their options are going to be very limited. And this administration, led by Biden, has failed miserably. Not only has it not been able to achieve Israeli targets in Gaza, it cannot stop a war in Lebanon. They want to achieve peace for Israel. They want to achieve normalization with Saudi Arabia as their main target. They want
And with
Saudi
Iran
Arabia.
as well, as not many people talk about, but you and I have talked about. They really don't want war with Iran, despite all their rhetoric from some of the crazy neocons. In reality, they don't want war with Iran because, as we've laid out, Iran is not a threat to Zionism or U.S. imperialism. The only real possibility I could foresee of a war breaking out with Iran is basically unintended consequences of, say, Israel getting a little bit overly zealous with some of its aggressions, and Iran is forced to retaliate to save face, and then a cycle, things unravel from there. But also, as far as Russia and China, I think it's worth mentioning neither of them, they have no interest in opposing Zionism. China, for example, is Israel's second biggest trading partner. There's a lot made out of Russia and China and this whole BRICS so-called multipolarity, but this so-called multipolarity has no problem with Zionism. Again, China is Israel's second biggest trading partner. They have military cooperation between the Israeli military and the Chinese military. Russia has had very good relations with Putin, has had very good relations with Netanyahu, even having him as a guest of honor at Victory Day parades in Moscow. It's also speculated, and I think this is a reasonable explanation, as to why Israel is constantly able to bomb Syria, supposedly Russia's ally, right? Israel is constantly able to bomb Syria without Syria retaliating. Now, Russia has S-300s, or the Syrian government has S-300 anti-aircraft, anti-missile missiles. Russia has S-400 surface-to-air anti-aircraft, anti-projectile missiles that are capable of, at least, at some point in all these attacks, they would have been able to down some of these aircraft. So what people speculate and what would make sense is that Russia has a deal with Israel, allowing them to bomb Syria. So I think that's a point that's very important to mention, is that Russia and China, they really have no interest in opposing Zionism. In fact, they are aiding and abetting Zionism at this point, particularly China with the trade that they do with Israel.
Yeah, I mean, China and Russia at the end of the day are going to look after their own interests. And China in particular has been active lately because it hosted a meeting of Palestinian political parties and called for a two-state solution and declaration of an independent state of Palestine. So it's been kind of meddling into that issue. But as you point out, their economic trade with Israel, and so is Russia's, falls in line with their own interests. Now, the American-Iranian relationship, on the other hand, is interesting because they meet in Iraq. They're both involved in subduing Iraq and preventing the Ba'ath from regaining power in Iraq, and from Iraq rising up again to become a prominent state as it was. And so that shows you clearly how they wheel and deal with one another. Even at the time of Trump, before Biden came to power, Trump never attacked Iran. Not inside Iran, though.
Yeah,
They wouldn't go inside Iran. I'm talking about targeting Ali Khamenei, targeting their generals, targeting their military bases. Any attack within the Iranian territory, we've never seen any American. Look at the difference between Iraq and Iran. They invaded Iraq with American troops on the ground. Can you imagine they do that to Iran today?
right.
Can they send
And to
American
clarify,
troops into
because some smartass is going to say, "Oh, you see, they want America to invade Iran." That's not what we want. We don't want America to invade Iran. Obviously not. But what Falastini Moghtareb is pointing out is the hypocrisy and the double standard there, and all these people that want to say, "Oh, the U.S. is so anti-Iran. Saddam was somehow backed by the U.S." Well, why did they invade one and not the other? That's the point. We're not calling for the U.S. We don't want the U.S. to attack anyone,
we don't
obviously.
we don't want Americans to attack anybody and take over their land. But have you asked? I'm posing this question to people who are supporting Iran. Have you ever wondered why American troops never went into Tehran, but they went into Baghdad? How come there are no aerial bombings of Iran taking place like they did in Iraq? How come there are no American troops going inside Iran's territory? It's because Iran serves American imperialism. The presence of the current Islamic Republic of Iran and its government serves American interests in the region. That's why they've never attacked Iran. Um, they collude on occupying and exploiting Iraq. They both have agreements with one another on Iraq.
That's
Iraq
right.
exposes that secret relation.
That's right. And I would also add Afghanistan as well. There's admissions from Iranian leaders even talking about how Iran aided the U.S. in invading both Iraq and Afghanistan. And Iraq was obviously much more of a threat to Zionism and imperialism because the whole history of socialism and anti-imperialism and the really strong development of Iraq. But even Afghanistan as well, they aided the U.S. aggression against Afghanistan. But bringing it back to the situation in Palestine and U.S. domestic politics, this whole thing, I think, has really opened the eyes of a lot of young people in this country, seeing what the U.S. government has done for the past year, backing a genocide to such an insane level where it can't be denied. You know, prior to this, the Democrats tried to portray themselves as, "Oh, we're the nice guys. Republicans, they're racist, they're horrible, they want to commit genocide," which is true about the Republican Party. Certainly, the leadership of the party, they represent a faction of the ruling class, but the Democrats have exposed themselves as being the same way. I think a perfect example of showing how the Democrats are racist as well is look at what happened during the Democratic convention. They had a Palestinian speaker who was delegate of the Democratic Party who wanted to give a speech at the DNC. And remember, the DNC goes for multiple days, for hours and hours and hours. It's not that they don't have enough time. They've got all the time in the world to have people give a speech. And it's not like she was uncommitted or against the Democrats. She wanted to give a speech while calling attention to the genocide going on against the Palestinian people. She was going to endorse Kamala Harris in that speech. But nonetheless, they didn't allow her to give the speech just because she's a Palestinian. That's the only reason, because she's a Palestinian. Again, from a logical perspective, even from their perspective, wouldn't they want someone to give a speech that's endorsing them, especially when they're in a situation where they know they're in danger with Arab Americans, Palestinian Americans, Muslim Americans? Wouldn't they want someone to give a speech from that community endorsing them? But the fact that she was a Palestinian outweighed all of that, which I think exposes just how racist anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian the Democratic Party is, and all their talk during the Trump years of being better than Trump and for inclusion, all of this, that went right out the window then. Not to mention that obviously the much bigger issue of them supporting the genocide in Palestine to such insane levels, such as, people probably forget this because so much has happened, Joe Biden parroted a story that has been retracted by the mainstream media, which was there were Zionist sources claiming that Hamas beheaded, I mean, this is just a horrible thing. It's horrible to even say, but this is what they came up with, that Hamas supposedly beheaded babies. First of all, the Israeli government, which is quick to make up lies and propaganda, said that they couldn't confirm this story. CNN and a lot of the mainstream media reported it, but CNN actually had to retract it. What did Joe Biden do? He said he saw the photographs of these victims of Hamas that were supposedly beheaded. He said he saw these photographs. Now that's another level. It's not just that he said that this is true and that it's horrible. He said that he saw these photographs. These photographs never emerged. As I said, the Israeli government came out and they're quick to come up with all kinds of, atrocities, true or false, against their opponents. They came out and said they can't confirm it. CNN had to retract it. One of the reporters who parroted this personally apologized for it. Yet Joe Biden parroted this. Furthermore, during the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, regardless of what anyone thinks of him, in that assassination, when Israel bombed to take him out, they fired so many missiles and leveled multiple apartment buildings, killing hundreds of people. So to kill one man, they killed hundreds of civilians. Kamala Harris, the candidate for the Democratic Party running for president this election, said that she supports it. Not even a word of concern for those hundreds of people killed in the process. So what we've seen is the complete mask off of the Democratic Party. They are a genocidal party, racist party, just like the Republicans are. And furthermore, they're aware of all of the atrocities of Israel since October 7th and before October 7th. Yet they've been giving them billions and billions of dollars of weaponry to carry out these atrocities. It's as if, there's a pyromaniac burning down everything in their sight, and someone is handing them cans of gasoline and lighters to them. Meanwhile, saying, because this is the other thing, sometimes when confronted about atrocities by Israel, State Department spokespeople say, oh, we're concerned about that and we're going to look into it. Of course, there's no follow-up on that. It's like handing this arsonist, someone setting fire, handing them gasoline and matches and saying, we're concerned about these fires, but here's some more gasoline and matches to continue the fires. Now, this has caused a huge issue, and this is another aspect of the significance of the Palestinian resistance, because who would have thought that prior to October 7th, the question of Palestine would be the key question of the election, the top controversy that's been going on over the past year? Who would have thought that this would be such a decisive issue in U.S. politics? At that point, to give you an example of what sort of the situation was like prior to October 7th, Norman Finkelstein, who a lot of people are aware of, a longtime critic of Israel, supporter of Palestinians, he said that before October 7th, I think he said around 2020, he had given up on Palestine, despite decades of his life advocating for opposing Zionism, especially him being a Jewish person. He didn't want Zionism to carry out its atrocities in his name, in the name of Jewish people. He felt that around 2020, I believe, he said that he had given up. He felt that Palestine had been defeated and that it was hopeless. But that after October 7th, it changed completely. He is now believes that Palestine will be liberated. This shows you how what happened in October and the subsequent events that have happened since then have just massively changed not just the situation in Palestine, but the politics within the United States. And no one could have imagined this before October 7th. Can you talk a bit about the upcoming election and the various points I just raised?
Yeah, absolutely. If you remember back, when we came out of the Corona pandemic, in 2022, the United States imperialists started a war with Russia through Ukraine. And everybody was talking about the Ukraine-Russia war. When October 7th, 2023 took place, all the world's attention now has been shifted to Gaza and Palestine. The Palestinian cause has become the number one issue in the world, including the US presidential elections. Now, the hypocrisy of the United States and its government is not only in its blatant support of both the Ukraine regime and the Israeli regime, that are both Zionists, incidentally, with billions and billions of dollars. Right now, as we speak, Americans are dying in North Carolina because of the floods. There's been 200 people that have died, and neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party could give a damn about them. So Palestine, October 7th, 2023, has exposed America's hypocrisy internationally with its support for Israel and Ukraine, and it has also exposed the American government's hypocrisy internally with neglecting its own citizens. How is it that American taxpayer money is now being sent to Zelensky in Ukraine and Netanyahu in Israel, but the US government doesn't have enough money to support the people that are dying under the floods in North Carolina? Palestine exposed Israel's criminal face to the world and exposed America's hypocrisy to the world. Speaking of the Palestinian delegate that wasn't allowed to speak at the Democratic National Convention, you do remember when Netanyahu came to Washington, and it was almost like an unbelievable party. I mean, people were standing, clapping for him, as this man has been implicated in genocide, and the whole world knows this, except the US Congress and the US Senate. There's nobody more blind to Israel than the American government is. So it's no surprise that they practice this political hypocrisy when it comes to a Palestinian speaker, giving all the attention to an Israeli murderer and criminal like Netanyahu, for the simple fact that they're all bought. These politicians are all paid for. All these politicians, whether in the US Congress or the US Senate, 99% of them receive money from AIPAC. They receive lobby money in millions and millions of dollars to support Israel. They're bought and paid for. So that it's no surprise that they react the way they do. They're not for the interests of the American people, certainly not the working class of American people. They do cater for the rich, ultra rich in America. And they're definitely going to be hypocritical on international issues that involve either Israel or its other Zionist allies. Also, I saw a video just today of an anchor in Fox News saying, Kamala Harris, could you not come up with more than $750 for people in North Carolina? It's ridiculous, the amount of neglect and just sheer, they're cheating the American people. You've got enough money to ship off to Israel, but you don't have enough to pay for the flood victims. Same thing on the Republican side. Lindsey Graham, big supporter of Israel in the American government. I saw a TikTok video today that shows he receives $1 million from AIPAC every year. Can you imagine? This guy is a millionaire just off of the AIPAC contributions to his person. So you can imagine what kind of stance he's going to take. Now, juxtapose this to the United Nations position on Netanyahu. When Netanyahu came to New York to give a speech, he gave it to an almost empty room. All the delegates from all over the world walked out of his speech. The exact opposite happens when Netanyahu addresses the US Congress and the US Senate. I think it's about time ordinary American citizens look into their government and look into changing this pathetic choice of a, bad Democrat Republican choice that is a non-choice for the American people. And that's why we need a third alternative. Now, right now, Jill Stein happens to be the best alternative for many people because she stands with Palestine and is in opposition to sending money to Israel. I can say at least she's not sponsored by AIPAC, but we all know that the chances of her winning the presidential election are not going to be high. But little by little, and through efforts like the ones you're doing, as little as they are, bringing more and more awareness, capitalizing on the victory of the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, I think we need a new alternative in the United States. We need a new grassroots movement that brings together American socialists working for Arab Palestine. I think we have enough base for it in the millions of Americans right now that are standing with Palestine in an unprecedented way. I remember going to the US 30 years ago that people didn't even know where Palestine was. When I spoke to people at the university or even in the street or my friends, I had to use a map to show them where Palestine is. Now there isn't anyone in America that's literate that doesn't know where Palestine is and doesn't know about the Palestinian cause. So we are really witnessing a historical moment. And I think the history books will write about the Palestine liberation movement making strides forward towards building an independent Palestinian state in the years to come. And I agree with Finkelstein. I think Palestine will be liberated and the collapse of Israel is imminent.
Yeah, and I want to add on to that. You mentioned that war criminal Netanyahu's visit to the United Nations. I'm very proud to say I participated in the protests against Netanyahu when he was in New York, and we successfully were able to breach where the police had gated off Netanyahu's hotel for a number of blocks. They had gated off so that they wanted to make it so that protests couldn't reach there. We were able to get onto the street right out front of Netanyahu's hotel. And the NYPD was not happy about that at all. Even though we're on the sidewalk, which is normally they try and harass you to get you off the street if you're on the street, try and push you to get on the sidewalk, and eventually they start arresting people. We were on the sidewalk already, and they started aggressively shoving people. They injured numerous protesters in that because we were giving a headache to Netanyahu. And I'm very proud to have participated in that because I think that was a historic moment. Netanyahu in that hotel in New York, it's reported that he ordered from just where we were protesting him, that block, that building he was in, he was ordering attacks against Lebanon. So I'm very proud to have participated in that. I live streamed that actually. And as you mentioned, the protests in the United States and around the world, but the U.S., as we're talking about now, have been massive, unprecedented. I've been involved in Palestine organizing for over a decade. Occasionally, 2014 when Israel was bombing Gaza, 2021, Israel increases its aggression. They're significant, sizable protests. But what has been happening now is unprecedented. Hundreds of thousands of people protesting for Palestine and massive protests across the country. For a year, this has been going on. Sometimes multiple a week. Sometimes, every other week. Through the freezing winter, below freezing, huge numbers of people, thousands of people in the street. I've been in these protests in the winter, in January, December, February, where it's literally freezing, snowing outside. There are thousands of people out in the street protesting. In the heat of the summer, in the rain, it doesn't matter. The protests are going. People are still coming out. This isn't going away. They aren't able to make this go away. And this is taking place. These protests are happening in numbers that I've never seen. You've been an activist. You're a little older than I am. You've been an activist prior longer than I have been. And you mentioned how before people have not, and like going back some decades, people might not have known where Palestine was. Well, that situation has changed. I'm curious what your opinion is as far as like the size of these protests compared to in the past. Well, there have been some, sizable protests in the past. I'm not going to say, there was nothing. Like 2014, there was some big stuff, and in other years. But in comparison, I mean, this is unprecedented, I would have to say.
Not only has the quantity increased significantly and people's awareness and outrage really at what's going on, but the quality has also risen. So, when we used to go out and protest, I was in Texas, and we would go to, a place like Austin, which is, the government hub of Texas. We would have to negotiate with people who would argue for a two-state solution. And we were opposed to a two-state solution. We've always been opposed to a two-state solution ever since I was a child. But that was common talk. And leftists in particular, anti-imperialists, would always adopt a two-state solution. We'd say, no, we reject a two-state solution. Well, nowadays, the chants are, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. When they say river to the sea, that means the entirety of Palestine. That's not talking about a two-state solution.
And often pro-resistance, explicitly pro-resistance chants and signs and flags and stuff today.
And my Facebook page, Nick, now has grown to nearly 2,000 people. It used to be a few hundreds. But I've been active in adding people, and whenever I see activists, especially Western activists, since I live and am active in the United States, the number of activists has skyrocketed that are pro-Palestine. And I learn every day, everywhere, Colombia, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Mexico, France, Britain, Scandinavia, Africa, Asia, China, Malaysia, Indonesia, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. They're joining the Palestinian fight, and they're calling for the liberation of Palestine. Now we're having to argue for positions with regards to Iran. We're not arguing anymore about the resistance. I just saw a couple of posts that Western activists have put up arguing that Hezbollah is not a terrorist organization. Hamas is not a terrorist organization. These are resistance organizations that are working to liberate their lands and their people. And so, you would have never heard any kind of talk like that 20, 30 years ago in the US, or even Europe for that matter. I was recently on a visit to Texas, my home state, and I saw a Palestinian flag hanging off of a balcony in Austin, Texas, capital of Texas. I would have never imagined seeing something like that 20, 30 years ago. Either the landlord would have come in and took it down, or the neighbors would have complained, or that person would have been, harassed for putting up a flag like that. Right now, it hangs proudly off of a balcony in a very central area of downtown Austin. But those are the kind of changes that if you've been in the US long enough, you'd be amazed at the times we're living in right now when it comes to Palestine. That's why we need to start a new grassroots political organization that benefits from this number of people and their awareness. So inshallah, I'll be working on that. once I go back to the US.
Yes, and I would urge viewers to stay tuned on that. Follow Falastini Moghtareb on where can people find you on Facebook?
Yeah,
Anywhere else?
Facebook would probably be the best place right now. And eventually, as we, situate ourselves better in the US, we'll come out more and more and be able to connect with people more. But right now, I'm building a grassroots network of American activists that are socialists that are going to help us create a new movement that's hopefully going to witness the birth of a Palestinian state in our lifetime.
Yes, because the struggle for liberation of Palestine is very much connected to the struggle for the working class in this country. We have to remember, and as you said, socialists, it's the ruling class of this country that is the reason why Israel is doing what it's doing. Israel is connected to the various American and Western corporations, and that's why it's an outpost of U.S. imperialism, prior British imperialism. Now there's sort of this sort of U.S./NATO Western imperialist bloc that's sort of one entity. The U.S. is by far the dominant, the main force within it, obviously. Israel is an extension of that. It's an outpost of that. Probably the most important outpost in the world for imperialism. And the defeat for imperialism anywhere in the world is a victory for the working class in this country. So I think that's a very important way of looking at all of this. And so we see how the struggle in Palestine has affected profoundly the political situation in the United States. The Democrats are now desperate to make up for the community that they've lost, which is the Arab American community, Palestinian and broadly Arab American and Muslim American community, and progressive voters, which honestly shouldn't have been voting for the Democrats. None of these groups should have been voting for the Democrats before, but obviously these actions have woken a lot of people up to the true nature of the Democratic Party. But still, the Democrats are dead set in supporting genocide in Palestine, and I think that shows that it doesn't matter whether it's the Democrats or Republicans, because if it were such a big difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, the Democrats would be acting smart for their own political interests, right? But actually it's funny, there's sometimes this talk of put country before party. Well, they're putting the class interests, the ruling class interests, and U.S. imperialist interests and Zionist interests before party. They're more willing to take the political risk of alienating voters. They're more willing to do that than to rein in Israel, because let's remember, the U.S. has every capacity to stop Israel from doing what it's doing. It's the U.S. that's giving all the weapons. Without U.S. backing, Israel could not last at all. We saw what happened on October 7th. They're very weak. They're a paper tiger. If they're not constantly backed by the United States, they would be defeated, like not just driven back and unable to achieve their goals. They would be overthrown by the resistance. So the United States, the Biden administration, is able to tell Israel to stop, and they would have no choice to do that. We've seen that in the past, actually. Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, when Israel was bombing Beirut, Reagan, of all people, who was an extreme neocon, horrible president, he picked up the phone and told Israel to stop, and Israel was forced to do what the U.S. told them, because that's the nature of the relationship. Israel is completely dependent on the United States. So despite all of this, the U.S., the Biden administration is fully backing this, and they can't be allowed to walk away from this. The Democratic Party can't be allowed to walk away from this. And I think more and more young people are realizing this and waking up to the true nature of the Democratic Party. And when you look at it, you've got this on one side, the Democrats, who are fully backing Zionism. Then on the other side, you have the Republicans and Trump, who, despite all of this extreme Zionism from Biden and the Democrats, what does he say? He says, oh, Biden is like a Palestinian. What the hell does that even mean? First of all, to say someone is like a Palestinian, that's like a compliment. That's not an insult. That should be seen as a compliment. The Palestinians are extremely steadfast in defending themselves and defending their country. But what does he mean by that? He's trying to say, oh, Biden is somehow against Israel. That tells you where Trump is coming from. He's even more of an extreme Zionist, which is hard to even fathom because Biden is such an extreme Zionist and facilitating this genocide. I think the difference really is just in rhetoric between the two. But it really shows how Zionism and imperialism are screwed, because whether it's Trump or Biden, they're not going to be able to defeat the Palestinian resistance. You know, despite the horrible criminal brutality of Israel, massacring children, you know, killing journalists, more journalists killed in this genocide, you know, framing it as a war, okay, calling it a war. More people killed and more journalists killed in this war than any other war before. Bombing hospitals, schools, killing aid workers, deliberately so. Despite all of this unlimited brutality, they're not able to defeat the Palestinian resistance. And that's why 1 year on, were they able to defeat Hamas? No, they have not. Hamas is active throughout Gaza. This is like so many cases of national liberation struggle, insurgency. The Israelis could come in, kill a bunch of people, but once they pull back, the resistance returns to that area. And they know that they're screwed one way or the other. That's why they're going to such extreme levels for a year doing this, because they don't know what else to do. Netanyahu, the Israeli regime, and it's not just Netanyahu, by the way, it's the Israeli state overall. They know that they can't defeat Palestinians. It's not just about Hamas, it's Palestinians. They cannot defeat the will of the Palestinians to fight to liberate their homeland. And, you know, now they're saying, oh, Hamas, it's just Hamas, that's the problem. We don't have a problem with Palestinians, just Hamas. Before that, it was the PLO. There's always, it doesn't matter which organization is leading the Palestinian resistance. They'll always say, oh, it's just this horrible organization. If we just get rid of them, everything will be fine. You know, if Hamas were to disappear, there'd be another group, Palestinian resistance group, and they'd be saying the exact same thing about that Palestinian resistance group. So despite all of this, they're unable to defeat the Palestinian people. And what does that mean for them? The flip side of that is that they know that they're going to lose in the end. So keeping that in mind, where do you see this going within the context of the conflict on the ground in Gaza and Lebanon, as well as U.S. politics and the upcoming election?
So right now we've got, let's say, 4 different issues that need to be resolved after the U.S. presidential election. Number 1, as far as the Americans are concerned, they're going to try to contain the conflict as much as possible. They're definitely going to be on the side of Israel, whether a Democratic president gets elected or a Republican president. They're going to continue to neglect their American people and their interests, and they're going to continue to support Israel with arms and weapons. But the question is, how far along are they going to go with regards to Iran and a possible confrontation between Israel and Iran, keeping in mind that that might drag in a Russian-American confrontation in the region. So this is on the part of the Americans and their presidential elections. The Arab governments have already launched an initiative. They want to, led by the Saudi Arabians. Saudi Arabia right now has launched a initiative to gather an international coalition to push for a 2-state solution. No big surprise there. It's been always their policy. Regionally speaking, the Israelis will eventually have to get out of Gaza defeated, The Americans will try to secure a deal for a prisoner exchange between Israel and Hamas, and maybe, possibly, a demarcation line. A demarcation line would be bringing in, let's say, United Nations troops, like they did a buffer zone in southern Lebanon, where there would be a buffer zone between Gaza and the Israeli borders, sort of a demarcation line after this conflict ends. My own personal aspirations, and this is what I would say to the leaders of Hamas, if you're smart enough, you're going to capitalize on this military government, or excuse me, on this military victory by declaring an independent Palestinian state in Gaza without involving the Palestinian Authority. Declare an independent state. Once the Israelis withdraw, secure a port, a seaport, secure an airport, try to gain international recognition from Russia, from China, from the European Union. Already you've got Ireland, you've got Spain that are willing to recognize a Palestinian state. The Chinese are willing to recognize a Palestinian state. Make your political moves that way. Capitalize on the victory in Gaza. Do not recognize Israel. Do not involve the Palestinian Authority, because they're just tools of imperialism and Zionism. Try to reconstruct Gaza, rebuild the buildings, the schools, the hospitals. You're going to have a lot of support from Qatar financially. You're going to have support from Turkey, possibly, in the reconstruction process. You may even have support from Iran financially, and rebuild your military capabilities, because the war with Israel is not going to end until we bring an end to Israel itself. And Israel will end eventually and collapse. And we're seeing the beginning of the end of Israel. In the United States, we have to continue to expand our network of pro-Palestine activists and build a political alternative for them. And shows like the ones you're doing and the work that you do on social media is increasing awareness, increasing the number of people that are aware of what's going on in Palestine, because Palestine is the key to liberation of the whole world from the negative effects of imperialism and Zionism that are currently damaging it and bringing it to a fall, as you can see everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And that's the reason why the imperialists are so dead set on backing Zionism, no matter what crimes the Israeli regime commits, because they understand too that the question of Palestine is key to the global liberation. From their perspective, the question of preserving their imperialist system. They understand that. And I think more and more people are starting to realize that around the world as well, that their fight, whether it be the working class in this country or oppressed nations throughout the world, their fight is the fight for the liberation of Palestine. And I think one of the key, if not the key lesson that has been learned over the past year is that resistance is absolutely tangible. Resistance is possible. The imperialists, the Zionists, they want to make it seem as though resisting imperialism and Zionism, it's futile. There's no point. Just surrender, make peace, and maybe you can get a few crumbs. But countless examples have shown that surrendering does not bring you any level of security. They will not be satisfied in just giving you a few crumbs. They want to destroy you. And we saw with Lebanon what happened. The lack of action by Hezbollah did not bring them safety. And that actually what will bring you safety and allow you to survive is by resisting with strength, with all of your strength, resisting. And that's what we've seen the Palestinian resistance achieve. And despite everything that Israel and the United States has thrown at them, they're not able to defeat the Palestinian resistance.